35 years after her triplet sons vanished without a trace, Keisha Williams was about to discover they had been hiding in plain sight all along. But on this quiet Sunday morning in her Detroit living room, she had no idea her world was about to shatter once again. The gentle hum of the space heater mixed with the soft gospel music streaming from her laptop as Keisha settled into her favorite armchair, coffee mug warming her hands. At 53, she had learned to find peace in these small Sunday rituals. Online, church services had become her sanctuary since the pandemic, a way to worship without the pitying glances that still followed her after all these years. Marcus was in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of him preparing their traditional Sunday breakfast creating a comforting backdrop. "Morning service starting, baby," she called out, adjusting the laptop screen as Pastor Johnson's familiar face appeared. Holy Cross Baptist Church in rural Mississippi wasn't their home congregation, but something about Pastor Johnson's gentle voice had drawn her to their live stream months ago. The congregation was small, intimate, mostly older folks she'd grown fond of seeing each week through the screen. As the camera panned across the modest sanctuary, Keisha took a sip of her coffee and let the hymn wash over her. The choir stood in their traditional burgundy robes, voices harmonizing beautifully on Amazing Grace. She had always loved watching the choirs. Something about the pure joy on their faces reminded her of simpler times, before her life had been split into two distinct eras, before and after. The camera zoomed in on the choir during the second verse, and Keisha's hand froze halfway to her lips. 3 young men stood side by side in the back row, their faces identical down to the distinctive dimple in their left cheeks, the same proud posture, the same warm brown eyes she had once kissed goodnight every evening. Her coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Then louder, desperate. "Marcus, come here. Now." The singing continued, those 3 faces glowing with spiritual fervor, completely unaware that their mother, a woman they wouldn't remember, was staring at them through a computer screen, her heart hammering against her ribs as 35 years of carefully constructed acceptance crumbled in an instant. Marcus rushed into the living room, dish towel still in his hands, and found his wife staring at the laptop screen with the same expression she'd worn that terrible August day in 1984. Her face had gone ashen, and she was trembling so violently that he could see it from across the room. "Keisha, what's wrong?" He knelt beside her chair, following her gaze to the computer. On screen, the choir continued their hymn, but Keisha's finger was pointing at 3 young men whose resemblance to each other was unmistakable. "It's them," she whispered. "Marcus, it's them." The words transported her back 35 years, to a sweltering Saturday afternoon when her world had been complete. She could almost smell the barbecue smoke drifting from the Hendersons' backyard, hear the laughter of children running through sprinklers, feel the sticky humidity that made her cotton dress cling to her skin. The annual block party had been the highlight of their summer. Neighbors gathered on Elmwood Street, sharing food and stories while children played freely in the safe cocoon of their community. Jamal, Malik, and Khalil had been bursting with 4-year-old energy that day, their matching red shorts and white t-shirts already grass-stained from their adventures. She remembered kissing each of their foreheads before sending them outside, how Jamal had insisted on wearing his favorite Detroit Tigers cap, how Malik had tucked his beloved toy car into his pocket, how Khalil had grabbed her hand and made her promise to watch him ride his tricycle later. "Stay where I can see you," she had called from the front porch, the same words she'd spoken hundreds of times before. In 1984, their street had been a sanctuary where children could play unsupervised, where every adult looked out for every child, where the biggest worry was scraped knees and hurt feelings. Mrs. Henderson had been watering her petunias across the street, occasionally waving at the boys as they chased each other around the front yard. The ice cream truck had made its rounds, playing that tinny melody that sent children running. Keisha had gone inside for just 20 minutes to help with the potato salad, trusting in the safety they'd all taken for granted. When she returned to the porch, the yard was empty. Jamal, Malik, Khalil. Their names had torn from her throat. As she ran barefoot into the street, spinning in circles, searching every shadow and corner. Mrs. Henderson dropped her watering can. Other neighbors emerged from their houses, and within minutes their peaceful street had transformed into chaos. The boys had simply vanished, as if they'd never existed at all. Marcus had cleaned up the shattered coffee mug and convinced Keisha to move to her small home office, where she now sat hunched over her desktop computer like a woman possessed. The Holy Cross Baptist livestream had ended hours ago, but she had managed to rewind and screenshot the moment that had stopped her heart. 3 faces filled her monitor, young men who couldn't be anyone but her sons. "Baby, you need to eat something," Marcus said from the doorway, holding a plate of the breakfast that had gone cold and forgotten. His voice carried the same gentle concern it had held for 35 years, but underneath was something new. Hope warring with the fear of watching his wife shatter again. "I need to find out who they are," Keisha murmured, her fingers flying across the keyboard with surprising agility for someone who had only reluctantly joined the digital age. She had pulled up the church's website, Facebook page, and every social media account she could find. Holy Cross Baptist Church, Millerville, Mississippi, population 847. She clicked through photo galleries, bulletin archives, anything that might give her more information. Marcus set the plate beside her and pulled up a chair. After all these years, he knew better than to try to talk her out of this. Instead, he became her anchor. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me look through these photos." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she scrolled. "The church posts pictures from every service, every event. If those boys are regular members, there'll be in other photos." For the next 2 hours, they combed through months of digital archives. Vacation Bible school pictures, church dinners, youth group activities. The 3 young men appeared sporadically, sometimes all together, sometimes just 2 of them, occasionally alone. In every image they looked happy, integrated, accepted. They appeared to be in their 30s, the right age for her boys who would be 39 now. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a Christmas concert photo from last year. "They're listed in the program: David, Daniel, and Darius Freeman." Keisha's breath caught. "Freeman, that's not their name. Their name is Williams." She stared at the printed program Marcus had found buried in the church's newsletter archive. David, Daniel, and Darius Freeman, age 38, members since 2015. Her finger traced their faces on the screen. "But look at their eyes, Marcus. Look at how Jamal always tilted his head, just like that when he smiled. See how Malik's left eyebrow is slightly higher? And Khalil?" Her voice broke. "Khalil always stood with his shoulder just a little forward." Marcus studied the screen, and she saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His intake of breath was sharp, sudden. "Jesus Christ, Keisha. That's them. That's really them." Keisha dialed the church's number at exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning. Her hands steady despite the caffeine tremors from too many cups of coffee and too little sleep. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, crafting a story that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a desperate woman. "Holy Cross Baptist Church, this is Mrs. Patterson speaking." The voice was warm, southern, tinged with the kind of hospitality that made small churches feel like family. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. My name is Keisha Williams, and I'm calling from Detroit. I've been watching your lovely services online." Keisha forced brightness into her voice, the tone she'd perfected during years of dealing with police officers and social workers. "I was particularly moved by your choir yesterday. I'm actually planning to relocate to Mississippi, and I was wondering if you could tell me more about your music ministry." "Oh, how wonderful. Pastor Johnson will be so pleased to hear that. Our choir is the heart of our worship." Mrs. Patterson's enthusiasm was genuine, and Keisha felt a stab of guilt for the deception. "Are you a singer yourself, dear?" "I am, and my family has always been musical. I noticed 3 young men in particular. I believe their names are David, Daniel, and Darius Freeman. They have such beautiful voices." There was a pause, subtle but telling. "Oh yes, the Freeman boys, they're such blessings to our congregation. I'd love to speak with them about the choir program. Would it be possible to get their contact information?" "Well now, honey, I can't give out personal information about our members. You understand? Privacy and all that. Mrs. Patterson's tone had shifted, becoming more guarded. "But I'd be happy to pass along your information to them." Keisha's heart sank. "Of course, I completely understand. Could you at least tell me how long they've been members? I'm curious about the church's ability to integrate new families." "Let me see." There was the sound of pages turning. "The Freeman family joined us in 2015. Lovely people, very devoted to the Lord." "The Freeman family?" Keisha pressed. "Are they married? Do they have children?" "I really shouldn't discuss our members' personal lives with strangers, Mrs. Williams. If you'd like to know more about our church, I'd suggest speaking directly with Pastor Johnson during our Wednesday evening service." After hanging up, Keisha immediately tried the church's Facebook page, sending messages to anyone who had commented on recent posts. Most went unanswered. One elderly woman responded that the Freeman boys were quiet types who kept to themselves, mostly. Another mentioned they lived out at the old Freeman place with their daddy. By evening, Keisha had called 3 more churches in the area, claiming to be a genealogy researcher, looking for the Freeman family. Each conversation hit the same wall of small-town protectiveness. These people knew their neighbors and weren't about to share information with outsiders. "They're protecting them," she told Marcus as he brought her another cup of coffee. "Something's not right about this Freeman family situation." Marcus nodded grimly. "Or they're protecting themselves from crazy people who call asking about church members." "I'm going down there," Keisha said suddenly. "I need to see them in person." The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the heart of America as Keisha drove south with the kind of desperate determination that had sustained her through 35 years of searching. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his silence heavy with unspoken concerns, occasionally glancing at his wife's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. They had been driving for 6 hours, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. The car, filled with tension that seemed to thicken with each passing mile. The radio played softly, gospel music that Keisha had hoped would calm her nerves, but instead seemed to mock her with its promises of peace and understanding. "Baby, maybe we should talk about what happens if they're not who you think they are," Marcus said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not saying they aren't our boys, but we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that this is another false lead." Keisha's jaw tightened. "You saw the photos, Marcus. You said yourself it was them." "I know what I said, but—" He ran his hands through his graying hair. "Keisha, you've thought you saw them before. Remember the boy at the grocery store in Atlanta? The young man at the gas station in Tennessee? Each time you were so certain." "This is different." Her voice was sharp with frustration. "Those were glimpses, split-second sightings. This is video evidence. I have screenshots, Marcus. I have their names. Names that aren't their real names," he pointed out carefully. "If these really are our sons, then someone has been hiding them for 35 years. Someone who gave them new identities, new histories. Do you understand what that means? The implication hung between them like a physical presence. If these were truly their boys, then someone had stolen not just their children, but their children's entire sense of self. The boys wouldn't remember their real parents, their real names, their real lives. They would be strangers wearing familiar faces." They stopped for gas in a small Tennessee town, and while Marcus filled the tank, Keisha sat in the air conditioning, staring at the screenshots on her phone. A young man with a beard approached. The passenger window, the gas station attendant, probably college-aged with kind eyes that reminded her of Malik's gentle nature. "Y'all got a long way to go?" he asked through the glass, making small talk while he cleaned their windshield. "Mississippi," Keisha replied, rolling down the window. "Visiting family?" The question hit like a physical blow. "Something like that," she managed. As they pulled back onto the highway, Marcus reached over and took her hand. "Whatever we find down there, we face it together," he said. "But promise me something. If these men don't recognize us, if they have families of their own, we don't turn their world upside down without being absolutely certain." Keisha nodded, but her fingers tightened around his. She was already certain. The question that terrified her wasn't whether these were her sons, it was whether her sons would want to be found. Holy Cross Baptist Church sat like a white jewel against the Mississippi countryside. its simple steeple reaching toward a cloudless sky. Keisha's hands trembled as she smoothed her dress, the navy blue one she'd worn to every important occasion for the past 15 years, from job interviews to court hearings. Marcus straightened his tie beside her, and together they walked up the concrete steps that would either reunite them with their sons or shatter what remained of her hope. The sanctuary was smaller than it appeared on the live stream, maybe 60, people scattered across worn wooden pews. The congregation was predominantly elderly and black, with a few young families filling the front rows. Keisha and Marcus slipped into a pew near the back, close enough to see everything but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. "Welcome, visitors," called out a round woman with silver hair, beaming at them from across the aisle. "First time at Holy Cross?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his wife. "We're visiting from Detroit." "Oh, how wonderful. Y'all are in for a treat. Our choir is just heavenly today." Keisha nodded politely, but her eyes were already scanning the small sanctuary, searching. Then the choir filed in from a side door, burgundy robes rustling softly, and time seemed to stop. There they were, 3 men moving in perfect synchronization, just as her boys had always done everything together. Even in their matching robes, she could see the subtle differences that had helped her distinguish them as children, one slightly taller, one with broader shoulders, one with that familiar way of tilting his head when he concentrated. They took their places in the back row, and when they began to sing Blessed Assurance, their voices blended with the same natural harmony she remembered from their childhood lullabies. Keisha gripped the pew in front of her, fighting the urge to cry out, to run to them, to gather them in her arms the way she'd dreamed of doing for 35 years. They were so close she could see the gold caps on their teeth, the way one of them, Daniel, according to the program, had the same small scar above his left eyebrow that Malik had gotten falling off his bicycle at age 3. "Jesus," Marcus whispered beside her, his voice barely audible. He saw it too, the unmistakable recognition that transcended time and circumstance. After the service, as the congregation mingled in the fellowship hall over coffee and cookies, Keisha watched her sons, she couldn't think of them any other way now, interact with their church family. They were polite, respectful, but there was something reserved about them, as if they were performing a role rather than living authentically. "Excuse me," she said to Pastor Johnson, a thin man with kind eyes. "Could you introduce me to your choir members? The 3 young men in particular, I understand they're the Freeman brothers?" The pastor's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid they've already left for the day. They don't usually stay for fellowship. Very dedicated to their father's farm, you understand." Keisha spotted them through the window of May's diner before they even parked. 3 men in their work clothes, sitting in a corner booth, heads bent over their coffee cups in quiet conversation. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she and Marcus entered the small restaurant, the bell above the door announcing their arrival, with a cheerful chime that felt completely at odds with the magnitude of this moment. "Table for 2? Asked the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a coffee-stained apron. "Actually," Keisha said, her voice surprisingly steady, "we'd like to join those gentlemen over there if that's all right." She gestured toward the corner booth and the waitress shrugged, leading them over. The 3 men looked up as they approached, their faces polite but guarded. Up close there was no doubt. These were her sons, aged 35 years, but unmistakably hers. The one she knew as Jamal had developed the same laugh lines around his eyes that Marcus had, while the boy she'd called Malik still had that serious expression he'd worn even as a toddler. "Excuse me," Keisha said, her voice catching slightly. "Are you David Daniel and Darius Freeman?" The tallest one, David, nodded cautiously. "Yes, ma'am. Do we know you?" "You might not remember me," Keisha said, sliding into the booth across from them despite not being invited. Marcus followed, his presence both comforting and necessary. "My name is Keisha Williams. This is my husband Marcus. We're from Detroit." The 3 men exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that identical siblings perfect early in life. "I'm sorry," Daniel said carefully, "but we don't know anyone from Detroit." Keisha reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph. The boys at age 4, gap-toothed grins and matching overalls, standing in front of their old house on Elmwood Street. She placed it on the table between them like evidence in a trial. "These are my sons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jamal, Malik, and Khalil Williams. They disappeared on August 18th, 1984. The silence that followed was deafening. Darius Khalil picked up the photograph, his hands shaking slightly. "Ma'am, I think you're mistaken. We're the Freeman brothers. We've lived in Mississippi our whole lives." "No," Keisha said, leaning forward. "Look at the photograph. Look at yourselves. You have the same dimple in your left cheek, the same cowlick in your hair." Her voice rose with desperation. "Jamal, you used to sing Three Little Birds before bedtime. Malik, you collected bottle caps. Khalil, you were afraid of thunderstorms, but you loved ladybugs." David stood abruptly, his face pale. "Ma'am, I think you need to leave us alone. We don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we're not your sons." "Please," Keisha whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please just look at the photograph. Look at your faces." "Our father is Reverend Calvin Freeman," Daniel said firmly. "He raised us after our mother died in childbirth. We don't have any connection to Detroit or to you." The three men left money on the table and walked out together, leaving Keisha staring at the photograph through her tears, Marcus's arm around her shoulders, the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. The Freeman compound sat at the end of a long gravel road, hidden behind a wall of pine trees and Spanish moss that seemed designed to keep the outside world at bay. As Marcus parked their rental car, Keisha studied the collection of buildings, a large farmhouse, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be dormitory-style structures. Everything was well-maintained but isolated, like a self-contained world, where outsiders weren't welcome. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. Before Keisha could answer, the front door of the main house opened and a tall man in his 60s emerged. Reverend Calvin Freeman moved with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to commanding respect, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his clothing simple but expensive. Behind him trailed the three men from the diner, their faces carefully neutral. "Mrs. Williams," Reverend Freeman called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned preacher. "David told me about your encounter today. I thought it might be helpful if we spoke directly." Keisha climbed out of the car, her legs unsteady. Up close, Freeman had the kind of presence that filled a room, or in this case, a yard. His smile was perfect, his handshake firm, but something in his pale blue eyes made her skin crawl. "Reverend Freeman, thank you for seeing us." She gestured toward Marcus. "This is my husband." Of course. Please come inside. Mary's made sweet tea." He ushered them toward the house with the expansive hospitality of the Deep South, but Keisha noticed how the three young men hung back, watching the interaction with expressions she couldn't quite read. The interior of the house was immaculate, religious artwork on every wall, family photographs carefully arranged on side tables, the kind of sterile perfection that suggested control rather than comfort. Mrs. Freeman, a pale, thin woman who looked much older than her husband, served tea with trembling hands and spoke, only when directly addressed. "Now then," Freeman said, settling into his chair like a king holding court, "I understand you believe my boys are your missing children." His tone was gentle, almost pitying. "I can only imagine the pain you've endured, losing your sons so young." "They are my sons," Keisha said quietly. "I know it sounds impossible, but—" "It is impossible," Freeman interrupted, his smile never wavering. "You see, Mrs. Williams, I delivered these boys myself in 1985. Their mother, God rest her soul, died bringing them into this world. 3 precious souls left motherless, taken in by the church, raised in the love of Christ." He gestured toward David, Daniel, and Darius, who stood against the wall like soldiers awaiting orders. "They've never known any family but this one." Marcus leaned forward. "But, sir, the resemblance to our boys is remarkable. Surely you can understand. The Lord works in mysterious ways," Freeman said smoothly. "Perhaps he's showing you these young men to help you find peace with your loss. Sometimes we see what our hearts desperately want to see." Keisha watched the 3 men during this exchange, noting how they never quite met her eyes, how they seemed to shrink into themselves whenever Freeman spoke. There was something profoundly wrong here, something that went beyond mere coincidence. "Boys," Freeman said suddenly, "why don't you show our guests the evening chores? Mrs. Williams might find comfort in seeing the good Christian lives you've built." As they filed out obediently, Keisha caught a glimpse of something in Daniel's eyes, a flicker of confusion or perhaps recognition, before it was quickly suppressed. Keisha found David alone by the chicken coop, scattering feed with the same methodical precision she remembered from watching Jamal organize his toy cars by color and size. The evening air was thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas, and for a moment she was transported back to those summer evenings in Detroit when her boys would help her tend their small garden. "David," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Mrs. Williams, you shouldn't be out here alone. Reverend Freeman doesn't like visitors wandering around." "I just wanted to talk to you," she said, stepping closer. "Away from everyone else, please." Something in her voice must have reached him, because he set down the feed bucket and faced her fully. In the fading light, she could see so much of the boy she'd lost, the serious expression, the way he held his shoulders, even the slight tremor in his hands when he was nervous. "You said something earlier about singing," David said quietly. "About 3 Little Birds. I don't know why, but that song has been stuck in my head all afternoon." Keisha's heart leaped. "You used to make me sing it every night. You said it kept the bad dreams away." She began to hum the melody and watched as his eyes widened. "Every little thing gonna be all right," David whispered, the words seeming to come from somewhere deep in his memory. His face went pale. How do I know that song?" "Because I taught it to you," Keisha said gently. "You were 4 years old, and you'd had a nightmare about monsters under your bed. I sat with you and sang until you fell asleep." David staggered, backward, his hand pressed to his forehead. "No, that's not... I don't have those memories. My mother died when I was born. Reverend Freeman told me you had a birthmark on your shoulder," Keisha continued, her voice urgent but soft, "shaped like a crescent moon, and you were terrified of vacuum cleaners because of the noise they made." "Stop!" David gasped. "But..." His eyes were distant, searching. There are these dreams sometimes, voices calling names that aren't mine, a woman's face that I can never quite see clearly." "Jamal," Keisha whispered. "Your name was Jamal Williams." The moment she said it, David crumpled to his knees as if the word had physical weight. Images seemed to flash behind his eyes, fragments of a life he'd been taught never existed. "There was a red tricycle," he said, his voice breaking, "and a woman who smelled like vanilla and sang all the time." "That was me." Keisha knelt beside him, fighting every instinct to pull him into her arms. "I wore vanilla perfume. You boys gave it to me for Mother's Day in a little bottle from the drugstore." Daniel and Darius appeared around the corner of the chicken coop, drawn by the sound of distress. When they saw David on his knees, something shifted in their faces, the same confusion, the same buried recognition struggling to surface. "What's happening to him?" Daniel demanded, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's remembering," Keisha said, looking up at all 3 of her sons. "You're all remembering." David looked up at his brothers, tears streaming down his face. "I think she might be telling the truth." Sheriff Thompson's office smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork, but to Keisha it felt like the first breath of hope she'd taken in days. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands, listened intently as she and Marcus recounted their story, occasionally glancing at the photographs and documents they'd spread across his desk. "Mrs. Williams, I've got to tell you, this is one hell of a story," Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. "But Calvin Freeman's been a pillar of this community for 20 years, runs a home for troubled youth, does charity work, never so much as a parking ticket." "That's exactly what makes him dangerous," said FBI agent Carter, who had driven down from Jackson after Keisha's frantic phone calls. She was younger than Keisha had expected, maybe 40, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. "Predators often hide behind positions of trust and authority." Carter opened her laptop and turned it toward them. "We ran a background check on Calvin Freeman. The man has 3 different social security numbers and no verifiable history. Before 1985, the same year your boys disappeared. Sheriff Thompson's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. That's impossible. He's lived here for decades. Has he? Carter pulled up a series of documents. The birth certificates for David, Daniel, and Darius Freeman were filed 6 months after your sons went missing. The handwriting analysis shows they were likely forged by the same person who created Freeman's identity documents. Keisha gripped Marcus's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. What about the other children at his compound? The ones in the dormitories? That's what worries me most, Carter said grimly. We've identified at least 8 children currently residing there, ages 6 to 16. None of them have verifiable histories either. Sheriff Thompson stood abruptly. Jesus Christ. You're telling me we've got a child trafficking operation right under our noses? It's more sophisticated than that, Carter explained. Freeman appears to specialize in taking children who won't be missed, runaways, kids from broken homes, children whose disappearances might be attributed to other causes. He creates new identities for them, indoctrinates them into believing they've always been part of his family. The sheriff was already reaching for his radio. We need to get those kids out of there now. Agreed, Carter said. But we need to be careful. Freeman has had 35 years to perfect his system of control. Those children, including your sons, genuinely believe he's their savior. An hour later, Keisha found herself in the back of a police cruiser, watching through bulletproof glass as a convoy of law enforcement vehicles approached the Freeman compound. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, social workers, and paramedics, an army mobilized to unravel decades of lies. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Carter's voice. Remember, these victims have been psychologically conditioned to protect their abuser. They may resist rescue initially. As they pulled up to the main house, Keisha saw David, Daniel, and Darius standing on the porch with Freeman, their faces pale but defiant. Even now, even knowing what she knew, her sons looked ready to defend the man who had stolen their lives. Freeman himself stood calm and dignified, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the approaching officers with the serene confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Calvin Freeman, Agent Carter called out through a megaphone, you're under arrest for kidnapping, child trafficking, and identity fraud. The calm mask finally slipped, and for just a moment, Keisha saw the predator beneath the preacher's facade. The search of the Freeman compound revealed horrors that made even seasoned investigators pause. In a hidden basement room beneath the main house, agents discovered filing cabinets filled with false documents, birth certificates, social security cards, medical records, creating fictional histories for dozens of children spanning 3 decades. Each file contained before and after photographs showing bright-faced children transformed into hollow-eyed shadows of themselves. Detective Martinez, who had flown in from Detroit to assist with the case, emerged from the basement carrying a box of evidence, his face grim. Mrs. Williams, we found your son's original belongings, he said gently. Clothes, toys, even their birth certificates. Freeman kept everything like trophies. Keisha held the small Detroit Tigers cap that Jamal had been wearing the day he disappeared, her tears falling onto the faded fabric. 35 years later, it still smelled faintly of childhood, bubble gum and summer grass and innocence lost. At the county courthouse, Calvin Freeman sat in orange jail scrubs, his dignity finally stripped away. The silver-haired preacher, who had commanded respect, was revealed as a man who had built his entire life on stolen children and shattered families. His lawyer, a nervous young man who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the charges, whispered frantically in his ear. 17 children recovered from the compound, Agent Carter announced to the packed courtroom. 8 currently living there. 9 more identified from the files whose cases we're reopening. The youngest victim was 4 years old when taken, the oldest was 12. One by one, the other victims came forward. Adults now, some with families of their own, all carrying the scars of childhood stolen and identities erased. Maria Santos, taken from a playground in El Paso in 1992. James Chen, who disappeared from a foster home in New Orleans in 1998. Each story followed the same pattern. Vulnerable children isolated from their support systems, Gradually convinced that their past lives were fiction, their new family the only truth they'd ever known. David, Daniel, and Darius sat in the front row, their faces etched with confusion and grief as the scope of Freeman's crimes unfolded. They were victims, but they were also witnesses to atrocities they were only beginning to understand. The man they'd called father, who had raised them with religious devotion and strict discipline, had systematically destroyed their connection to their real family. The defendant operated what can only be described as a sophisticated child trafficking ring, the prosecutor stated, masquerading as a religious sanctuary while systematically erasing the identities of vulnerable children. When Freeman finally spoke, his voice carried none of its former authority. "I saved those children," he said quietly. "I gave them homes, structure, purpose. I loved them." "You stole them," Keisha said, standing in the gallery. "You stole 35 years of their lives and 35 years of mine." As Freeman was led away in shackles, Keisha felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache where justice should have been. Her sons were alive, but the boys she had lost were gone forever, replaced by men who carried their faces but not their memories. The real healing, she realized, would have to begin now. The house on Elmwood Street looked different than it had. In 1984, smaller somehow, as if 35 years of grief had compressed its dimensions. Keisha had spent the past month preparing fresh paint, new furniture, 3 bedrooms set up for sons who were no longer boys. The neighborhood had changed too. Most of the families from that terrible August day had moved away, taking their memories with them. Jamal stood on the front porch, where he had once played with toy cars, his face a mixture of recognition and bewilderment. The memories were coming back in fragments now, flashes of birthday parties and bedtime stories, the sound of his mother's voice singing him to sleep. But they felt like scenes from someone else's life, disconnected from the man he had become. "This is where we lived?" Malik asked, his voice soft with wonder. He was the most cautious of the 3, the one who questioned every recovered memory, afraid to trust feelings that had been buried for so long. "This is home," Keisha said simply, though the word felt fragile, like something that might shatter if spoken too loudly. Khalil, who had been the most affected by the revelation, the one whose memories came flooding back in painful waves, touched the doorframe with reverent fingers. "I remember this blue paint," he whispered. "You let us help you paint it. I got more on my clothes than on the house." Marcus carried in their few belongings. Everything they owned fit in 3 small suitcases, a lifetime of possessions that reflected the controlled existence Freeman had imposed. In the living room, extended family waited nervously. Cousins who had their own children now, aunts and uncles who had aged into strangers, all trying to navigate the impossible mathematics of lost time. "We don't expect you to remember us," said Keisha's sister Diana, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the 3 men who had once been her nephews. "We just want you to know you were loved. You were always loved." The first few weeks were tentative, careful. Conversations that started and stopped, meals eaten in awkward silence, nights when Keisha would lie awake listening for sounds from their rooms, afraid they might disappear again. The boys, she still thought of them as boys sometimes, were patient but distant, like polite houseguests trying not to impose. Slowly, routine began to build bridges where memory had failed. Sunday morning coffee became sacred time, when they would sit together and piece together fragments of the past. Khalil started helping with the cooking, his hands somehow remembering the rhythm of stirring pancake batter. Malik found himself humming songs he couldn't name, melodies that had been buried but not destroyed, and Jamal, her firstborn, who had always been the leader, began to call her Mama again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, as if testing whether the words still fit. "It's going to take time," the family therapist had warned them. "Healing isn't linear. There will be setbacks, confusion, moments when the past feels more real than the present." But as Keisha watched her sons, her men, learning to be a family again, she understood that sometimes the most profound victories were measured not in what was recovered, but in what could still be built from the pieces that remained. Home wasn't a place they returned to. It was something they would create together, one careful day at a time,